Welcome to the Pro Ticker Deep Dive. Today we're tackling really a critical financial puzzle right at the heart of the digital world we all live in. We're diving deep into this huge kind of underlying financial pressure that's building up inside the biggest platforms you use every single day. You know, Meta, Netflix, YouTube, all those digital giants. You, the consumer, you open the app and the experience feels, well, perfect, right? The interface looks slicker than ever, the content seems endless, and those recommendations, sometimes they're spookily accurate.
And that smooth surface, that's exactly what we need to look past today.
Yeah.
Yeah, the platforms look invincible. And just by sheer size, you'd think they're thriving. The revenues are honestly pretty huge.
Yeah.
Netflix reported, $41.2 billion in 2024 revenue. Meta hit $164 billion. Massive numbers. But our analysis shows there's this really profound kind of silent shift happening underneath all that top-line growth, their margins. They're quietly, structurally compressing. And this margin squeeze is, I argue, the most complex and maybe underestimated challenge these companies are facing heading into 2026.
Okay, so let's be really clear for you, the listener. We are not talking about shrinking revenue here. That would be, a sign of immediate failure, something obvious. What we're talking about is the cost of growth, the expense of actually maintaining this slick experience and fighting off all the competition. That cost seems to be rising significantly faster than the revenue itself. Is that right?
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. The enormous cost of getting exclusive content, the need for continuous, just massive investment in computing infrastructure, the sheer financial toll of competition, all those expenses are climbing, and climbing fast, exponentially in some cases.
Yeah.
If you actually track where the capital is going, the outcome is, well, it's sobering. These platforms, they might actually never return to those sky-high, almost monopolistic margin profiles that investors got so used to back in the 2010s.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe we should start by establishing that high point, the so-called golden era,
Right.
because back when Meta and Netflix were scaling up through the 2010s, they really did have a kind of unfair advantage, didn't they?
Oh, they absolutely did. They were scaling in an environment that was just uniquely advantageous and low cost, relatively speaking. For Meta, think about it. They scaled with minimal content investment because users created pretty much everything. For both of them, network effects were so powerful they kept users locked on. Competition was more fragmented back then. And crucially, ad budgets were just migrating predictably and pretty cheaply from traditional TV and print right into their digital platforms. It was like a perfect storm for margin expansion.
And that led to, well, frankly, ridiculous profitability. We saw Meta's peak margins around 2020 that must have made traditional media companies who had to, pay for everything pretty jealous. And Netflix, even while it was spending heavily, was being promised this clear path to 50% plus operating margins by Wall Street. But that whole environment, it just shifted pretty abruptly around 2022.
It really did. And we can basically isolate four major forces that kind of converged and broke that old system. The first one was probably the simplest: ad market saturation. I mean, there's only so much advertising money in the world, right? As more platforms jump in, TikTok, Amazon, retail media competition just intensified like crazy. That drove down the returns on every ad dollar and significantly slowed the growth of cost per thousand impressions, CPMs.
Okay, so the well isn't dry, but every sip just costs a little bit more effort, a little more money. The second force you mentioned was the content arms race. It turned out network effects on their own weren't enough anymore. Differentiation needed massive, exclusive content investment, particularly in the streaming world.
Exactly. And that content spending, it created this structural floor under their costs. They just couldn't go below it. Netflix had to stabilize its annual content spending at around $16 billion just to stay competitive. Think about that number, $16 billion every single year. And then every other major player, Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, Amazon, they all copied this really capital-intensive model. That ensures that content costs are going to remain a permanent major drag on the whole sector's margin potential.
Okay, number 3. This one feels structural too, and it's about how we use these platforms. The global pivot to short-form video. TikTok's crazy success basically forced giants like Meta with Reels and YouTube with Shorts to invest heavily just to compete.
Right. But here's the catch. Short form is inherently lower margin than traditional long-form content. And this is a really key technical point for you to remember. Why is a 30-second reel less profitable than, say, a 15-minute standard YouTube video? Well, in 15 minutes of long form, the platform can serve you several high-value ads pre-roll, mid-roll. But in a 30-second super fast scrolling short form feed, maybe you can only serve one quick ad per session, if that. That drastically cuts the total potential ad space per hour of viewing, and that naturally lowers the margin on the entire business line. It has to.
And finally, the fourth force, This one seems to be hitting everyone at the same time. The massive AI infrastructure bill.
Absolutely unavoidable, yeah. The race to build proprietary world-class AI models, which, by the way, power those hyper-accurate recommendations that keep you scrolling and watching. That race requires just monumental capital expenditure, or CapEx, on data centers, networking, computing power. We're talking tens of billions annually, hitting the balance sheets right when advertising efficiency is also declining. That combination, that's the very definition of a margin squeeze.
Okay, so that structural pressure, it plays out very differently across the major players. Let's look
Mhm.
at Meta first. They seem like the clearest example of this AI cost burden hitting home.
Yeah, Meta is still, let's be clear, immensely profitable. Their operating margin is around 40%, still very high, but the trend is undeniably negative.
Yeah.
Their operating margin, which peaked, I think it was 42.18% in 2024, it compressed down to about 40.1% by Q3 2025. Now, a 2-point drop might sound minor, but for a company that size, that actually reflects a truly gargantuan increase in spending somewhere.
Right, a 2-point drop when revenues are still growing that fast. That reflects a huge shift in where the money's going. Is that spending sustainable? Are investors fully buying the long-term benefit of this AI investment, or are they just kind of panicking about the quarterly cost?
Well, right now, the market seems to be panicking more about the short-term cost. And management isn't exactly helping them feel better. Infrastructure and AI investments are the single biggest expense driver, they've said that. Meta disclosed that operating expenses grew, get this, 32.1% quarter over quarter. That substantially outpaced revenue growth. And on top of that, management has warned investors of noticeably larger future capex. That signals they view this spending as absolutely mandatory and likely elevated for a while, not just a temporary blip. It's an arms race they feel they must win to stay relevant, even if it costs them margin points in the short term.
Okay, so Meta is battling these huge infrastructure bills. What about Netflix? Does that capital expenditure battle, which we also saw earlier with the content arms race, look any different over there?
Netflix faces something slightly different, what we might call the content ceiling. It stems from the way they account for content costs amortization. That $16 billion annual content spend we talked about, which is nearly 40% of their revenue, that's just the cost of doing business for them now. It's like a structural floor they can probably never dip below without risking, a subscriber revolt.
You mentioned content amortization creates margin volatility. Can you break down what that means for their bottom line practically?
Sure, it means they pay for a show, like, upfront, but they recognize that cost on their books over several years. So if they have a quarter with a massive slate of new hit shows launching, the cost they recognize in that quarter, the amortization, will suddenly shoot up. That can temporarily compress the margin, even if revenue is steady or growing. We saw this play out despite a strong Q2 2025 operating margin of 34.1%. They explicitly warned investors of a structural compression coming down to the 28-30% range in the second half of 2025. That kind of warning. It shows they know they are now in a much more disciplined operational efficiency game. It's not a land grab anymore where they can just spend limitlessly.
Okay, then let's turn to YouTube. Their profitability is often harder to see clearly because it's buried within the massive Google conglomerate, but the pressures must be there too, right?
Oh, definitely. You see, the AI cost burden reflected crystal clear in Google's overall CapEx guidance. That number hit a truly stunning $75 billion projected for 2025. That's basically the price of admission for the entire AI arms race, and YouTube's operations absolutely share in that immense infrastructure burden. And then for YouTube specifically, the short-form challenge is obvious. While Shorts revenue is growing, which is good news for them, internal analysis confirms it's still a significantly lower margin business line than their traditional long-form videos. They have to play the short-form game, but they're doing it at a cost to their overall profitability profile.
Right, and all this cost pressure is compounded by these ad and creator wars they all seem to be facing. It's driving down the basic economics per user, per view. Let's talk about that advertising paradox you mentioned. Advertisers are paying more, but efficiency seems to be declining across the board.
Yeah, the CPM deceleration is really critical here. Meta's CPM growth in 2024 was only 5% year over year. That's a big slowdown. TikTok slowed even more dramatically, from 19% growth in 2023 down to just 8% in 2024. Meanwhile, advertiser costs on TikTok are actually rising at over 12% annually. And that's the paradox. Advertisers are paying more, mostly because there's more competition and scarcity for the base slots. But the platforms aren't necessarily delivering the same amount of value creation back to that advertiser for the higher price. So the platforms end up having to absorb some of that pain into their own unit economics, hitting their margins.
And the other major drain you highlighted is creator compensation. Keeping the content flowing costs real money. Platforms have to make this kind of ruthless choice between margin or talent.
And YouTube clearly chose talent. They pay out roughly $10 billion annually to creators through their revenue-sharing programs. That massive payout makes it the #1 place for creators. It ensures a constant supply of content, but it is a direct and permanent drag on YouTube's margins. No way around it.
And we saw the flip side, the potentially devastating consequence when TikTok seemed to drastically underfund its creator payouts initially.
That's right. That was a fascinating case study. TikTok's Pulse program, their main monetization tool for a while, generated average creator earnings of only about $5 per applicant. $5. I mean, that's not a serious creator strategy. That's almost insulting and totally unsustainable. That one detail tells you almost everything about their perhaps short-sighted prioritization of margin over building a sustainable talent pool early on. And it led, predictably, to a significant talent exodus towards YouTube, where creators felt they could monetize both long-form and short-form content much more effectively.
Okay, so given these big structural walls, the AI capex, the content costs, the slowing CPMs, how are these platforms actually trying to navigate this squeeze? They must have some levers they can pull for margin recovery.
Oh, absolutely. They're not just sitting back. They have, broadly speaking, 3 primary strategic levers they're pulling. The first is AI optimization, aimed squarely at stabilizing that advertising issue we just discussed.
Okay, how does that work in practice?
Well, Meta, for example, is pouring resources into its Advantage Plus 2.0 suite. That's basically an automated ad product. The goal is to use AI to increase ad relevance and improve the return for the advertiser. Make every ad dollar work harder. YouTube's doing similar things with automated ad placement tools. The hope is, if AI can stabilize or maybe even slightly boost CPMs by making ads more effective, that helps the top line hold up better against those rising costs.
Makes sense. What's the second lever?
Diversifying into higher margin revenue streams, basically getting away from relying only on volatile advertising dollars.
Ah, subscriptions and premium tiers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a huge strategic shift for some of them. Netflix is leaning really heavily on its premium ad-free subscription tier. That carries much higher margins than its newer ad-supported model. Similarly, look at Google's strategy with YouTube. They're pushing YouTube Premium, YouTube Music, and YouTube TV hard. Those subscription products, collectively, generated over $12.9 billion in quarterly revenue back in Q1 2025. And crucially, those subscription dollars generally carry inherently higher, more stable gross margins than relying purely on ad fluctuations.
Okay, AI optimization, diversification. What's the third lever?
Strategic international expansion, and specifically content localization.
Right.
So by aggressively localizing content commissioning shows in markets like India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Netflix, for example, can keep production costs substantially lower than typical Hollywood budgets. They can drive massive engagement and subscriber growth in those regions at a fraction of the cost of a flagship Hollywood blockbuster.
Yeah.
That directly helps their overall global margin recovery efforts.
Okay, so there are strategies. But the risks, they still seem formidable. We started this whole conversation talking about the squeeze, and we probably need to end by looking at the threats that could make margin recovery difficult or even impossible.
Yeah, the risks are very real. Regulatory pressure is a big one.
Yeah.
It's intensifying, especially in the EU, but also potentially in the US. Things like potential antitrust action or stricter data privacy rules could significantly reduce advertising effectiveness and just cap growth potential further.
And then there's the issue of subscriber saturation looming, particularly for companies like Netflix.
Definitely. Netflix is getting close to saturation in its most developed high-value markets. Their Q2 2025 net subscriber adds, which were 8.5 million, actually represented a deceleration. That forces them into difficult choices. Either rely on potentially painful price increases, which always risks significant churn, or lean more heavily on that lower margin international growth strategy we just talked about. Neither is ideal for margins.
But the most significant structural risk, the one that really feels like it defines the future of this whole squeeze, it sounds like it's that AI CapEx floor.
I think that's right. If the high cost of building out this next generation AI infrastructure continues for, say, 5 to 10 years, which is what basically all technologists seem to expect, then margin recovery is going to be severely limited. It just has to be.
Right.
Both Meta and Google have already signaled they expect these elevated capital expenditure levels to continue through at least 2026. So the money being spent to build the future platform is actively, you could argue, destroying some of the profits of the current platform. It's a tough balancing act.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for you, the investor listening in. The market is already pricing this compression in, isn't it? Even when the headline revenue numbers look superficially positive.
Absolutely. You can see it clearly. We've seen Meta's stock become increasingly volatile throughout 2025. It swung widely between $600 and $750 a share, primarily because the market is just hypersensitive to any whisper about CapEx guidance from management. But maybe more tellingly, we are seeing PE multiple contraction across the board for these companies.
Can you give us the specific data on that contraction and just quickly explain why that matters so much?
Sure. Meta's forward price to earnings multiple, that's the ratio that reflects investor optimism about future earnings. It contracted from around 30x in early 2024 down to about 22x by late 2025. Netflix saw a similar slide from maybe 35x down towards 28x. This kind of steep contraction, it reflects deep market skepticism about how sustainable future earnings growth really is. The investment implication is pretty unambiguous. The era of automatic, easy margin expansion is over. These companies are now maturing. They're still extremely profitable, almost like utilities in some ways, but they are no longer viewed as those high-growth compounding machines that deserve sky-high valuations anymore.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the big picture? Let's try to wrap this up. Our final takeaway for you is that revenue will probably keep growing. These platforms are just too entrenched to actually shrink overall, but operating margins look like they're settling into a permanently lower regime, potentially 5, maybe even 15 percentage points lower than those peak levels we saw back in 2018, 2022. Success now belongs not just to the fastest grower, but probably to the operator who really focuses laser-like on profitable growth and disciplined unit economics.
Exactly. And that required shift from that old land grab mentality to this new operational efficiency game. It has a direct impact on how you should probably analyze these companies now. Investors should likely be tracking cash flow targets much more closely. Think about Netflix's guidance of $8 to $8.5 billion in free cash flow for 2025. That becomes a primary metric. Be more important than just relying on simple revenue multiples like in the past. And this raises a really important final question, maybe for you, the consumer. Will this big shift towards intense operational efficiency and heavy AI implementation ultimately lead to a better, more optimized content experience for us? Or will it just lead to higher subscription prices as these platforms fight tooth and nail just to maintain their new, somewhat lower profitability floor?
That is a great question to leave hanging in the air. Food for thought.
See you all in the next ProTicker Deep Dive.